Apart from our remarkable chapel, we also hold the largest collection of hatchments in any church building in Wales. Our neighbouring church, St Basil's in Basildon, has 6, and we have 11. Welsh Pool Museum has the largest collection anywhere in Wales, with 14. But where they are different to us, all of ours relate to a single family, whereas the ones in Welsh Pool relate to several families. So we've got the largest collection of hatchments for a family group still in their original location. So we're quite proud of that as well. The hatchments fall into 2 periods. 4 are from the Victorian era, 1856 to 75, and 7 are from the Georgian period, 1767 to 1792. And that collection of 7 actually tell quite an interesting story. They are large. You don't realize how large they are until you get up close to them. Ours, 5, 6, 7 meters above the ground, but they are actually 2 meters across. So they are pretty hefty. Now, what are they? Well, quite simply, they are a wooden frame covered in canvas and painted. They are quite ornate and quite complicated, and they're pretty good art, actually. They're works of art in their own right. They came to the UK probably in the early 17th century from the continent, and they have their origins basically in medieval heraldry. They were originally called an achievement, so a hatchment is actually a corruption of that word, and the achievement is from the French word achievement. They were quite common a couple of 100 years ago in Britain, but by the last century they were much reduced, and probably now only relate to the most wealthy families and for royalty. Where they came from is basically that these were symbolic of the shield which a medieval knight would have had in battle or in tournaments. So they basically comprise at the centre an escutcheon, which most people would recognise as a shield with a coat of arms. And what would have happened is when a knight was killed or died, his supporters would have carried these hatchments in front of his body during his funeral procession. When you think that ours are 2 meters across, I can't imagine that these supporters would have carried such large things in a funeral procession. And if you look around other churches, you do see very much smaller hatchments decorating the walls. But the custom became that after the funeral, and maybe even after as much as a year, by continuing to display the hatchments outside people's homes, they would then be placed into the parish church for posterity. From what I understand, many churches and many vicars have, over the years, looked at these things which had started to deteriorate because they've only made out of canvas, and have possibly thrown them out, even though now we would value them as being works of art. Returning to the messaging point about letting people know that somebody has died in a noble household, they don't really work. The problem is that they don't have many words on them. And in fact, they're not meant to even have the name of the deceased on there. So if you were giving notice that somebody has died, now if you look at the one on the screen, how do you know? You've got the coat of arms, but how do you know whose coat of arms it actually is? Ours are quite unique, actually, because if you notice on the frame, there are some extra words. You would normally only have a family motto or perhaps a bit of Latin as a religious inscription. But the one we have here actually says, this is Thomas Morgan, Esquire, MP of Tredegar, who died in 1769, aged 67. None of that is original. We suspect that this extra detail was added in the 1950s by Harry Seacombe's father. You know Harry Seacombe, of course, the famous Welsh comedian and singer and goon. But his brother was actually the rector in Machen in the 1950s. And his father obviously had some skills, and he restored 10 of our 11 hatchments at that time. So we suspect that it was this chap Seacombe who actually added this additional information to be helpful, but it's not strictly accurate. So the only way to work out whose hatchment we're actually looking at is to look at the coat of arms and work it out. It's not an easy job. So we've got these large 2-meter diamond-shaped boards hanging on our walls. They were probably made by artisan carpenters and painters from either Tredegar or Rupera. And they are not to be confused with a monument. If we look at the next slide, we can see how they are so very different. We've got Thomas's hatchment alongside the monument for John the London merchant. And you can see that very simply, the only words on the hatchment is basically the inscription which sits underneath the escutcheon. But if you compare that with the inscription on John the London merchant's monument, there's quite a lot of information there, and it tells us quite a lot about John. In many ways, you think the monument is more of a statement of the achievements than perhaps the hatchment is. But don't be lulled into any sort of false belief on this. What we can say about a hatchment is that it is not only a work of art, but it actually is a storyboard. Everything on the hatchment has a meaning. The coat of arms tells lots of stories about the family, and the bits around the edges are actually contain an awful lot about what that person did in life. Here we have, it's Thomas's hatchment on the left again, but on the right, we've got Jane Morgan, who was Thomas's wife. Now, if we look at Jane first, we'll notice that the background is half white and half black. You'll also notice that I've headed up this slide as with the dexter side, the right, which you might think is on the left, and the sinister side, which is the left, which you would probably think, well, surely that's my right. The right and left is actually totally accurate for a hatchment, because the way that you refer to what is left and right is not from your perspective as you view the hatchment from the front, but it's actually to be viewed from the back. And the reason for that is, if we return back to medieval times and all these knights in armor, you've got to imagine that this is actually the shield that a knight was holding. So the dexter side is the right. You might remember it because that is where the knight would hold his sword in his right hand. And the sinister side is the left, where the knight would have held his shield. So when I'm talking about dexter and sinister, as we go through the talk, just remember it's the sword side and the shield side. But if we look quickly at Jane first, the reason why, so the dexter side is white, is because she is the deceased person. The black side is for her husband. By contrast, if you look at the hatchment for Thomas, you see the background is all black. Now, this means that Thomas was single. He didn't have a wife at the time he died. So that's the first sort of story that you can interpret by looking at a hatchment. Whether they were married, whether they were single, whether they were a widower, and so on. If Jane had died after Thomas, the background would have been black, and that would have denoted that Jane was actually a widow. So black and white, married, all black, single. And here we are looking at General Thomas Morgan, the father, in a bit more detail. And we can look at his son with Jane, who was Colonel Thomas Morgan. And if we focus on the escutcheon, we can see that the coat of arms for General Thomas, the father, includes a quartering of 4 at the back of the shield, and there's a quartering of 4 for his wife in the middle. If you then look at Colonel Thomas, you can see there's a quartering of 6. A quartering means simply that there's a coat of arms. So it's not a quarter of the shield at all. You could literally have dozens of coats of arms on the escutcheon, depending on how far back you want to go in your own personal coat of arms and claiming heritage to all your paternal and maternal lines. And this is evidence because you can see that the quartering for Colonel Thomas is 6. And we can see that they comprise, there's Morgan, Meredith, Bletherey, and Llywelyn there, exactly the same as his father's. But we've got an extra one which has appeared, which is the chevron and the stars, which if you look at it, you can see that that is actually Colchester, which was Jane Morgan's maiden name. So as you can see, as you go from father to son, mother's arms becomes added to that of the father. So it's picked up the maternal line and it's added it as you go forward. So we know by comparing these two arms that the one on the right for Colonel Thomas is a child of General Thomas and Jane, because the arms have just flowed through to the next generation. And as we can see from this, because there's a black background for Colonel Thomas, he died unmarried. And in this case, he died as somebody who had never married, so he was a bachelor. So we're getting a bit of the life story of these people just by looking at their arms. If we move to the next slide, we'll have a look at the bits around the edges of the shield. This is the area which is used to support the escutcheon. And if we look at the one on the right, which is Charles Morgan, you can see that he's another one who died unmarried, but because the background is all black. However, in this case, it's all black because he had outlived his wife. What you can also see from this is that in the middle, there's a shield, which is a new coat of arms, which has been introduced, which is for his wife. And it's in the middle because Charles was fortunate enough to marry an heiress. So the fact that his wife's coat of arms has come into the center of his shield, it's sitting there in a position which is called in pretense. And in pretense basically means he's pretending to act for his wife's father. So and of course, at this time, when you married an heiress, it was more than likely that the husband would inherit the wife's inheritance when the time came. So he was just pretending to look after the cash until it arrived, if you like. By contrast, if we look at the hatchment on the other side of the slide, this is for Miles Milman. And you can see that if you look at the arms on the Dexter side of this, which is the Milman arms, it's been what they call impaled. And here we'll see that you'll recognize the griffin for the Morgan arms. And in this case, this was one of the Gould Morgans. So we've got the arms for the Gould family there, but they're sitting side by side. Now, Miles married, just trying to think of the names, is Maria Margarita Morgan, who was one of the daughters of Charles Gould. The point here, it's sitting alongside the Milman arms. And this actually denotes that Maria Margarita came to Miles not as an heiress, but without any likelihood of inheriting. As you will probably realize, the Morgans were very keen to pass any inheritance down the male line. So a Morgan daughter was very unlikely to ever become an heir to the Morgan estate. But what is most significant about Miles Milman's hatchment is it is absolutely magnificent. This is probably the best hatchment we have at Lower Machen Church. And the reason for this is that Miles was actually a hero. He served with Wellington in the wars against Napoleon and was quite an important soldier, Peninsular War, where he actually came close to death. In one of the battles, the ammunition which was being used by his battalion exploded and set fire to grass, and many of his comrades actually died there by being burnt because the dry grass just caught them and they were burnt alive. He was badly injured, but was rescued by a foot soldier who managed to drag him away. He was taken a prisoner by Napoleon's army, but he lived. And if you look closely at this hatchment, you can see that there are battalion flags decorating the left and right side. And if you look very closely at the bottom, you can see there are a couple of cannon just sitting at the very bottom of the escutcheon. And in particular, there is a medal which Miles was awarded for his bravery in serving during the Peninsular War. And that is the end of the first talk.